Computer science educators around the country are integrating computer science in many different ways, but which one works better and for what context? Today's paper is titled Rethinking Integrated Computer Science Instruction, a cross-context and expansive approach in elementary classrooms. This paper is written by Umar Shehzad, Jody E. Clarke-Midura, Kimberly Beck, Jessica Shumway, and Mimi M. Recker. Apologies if I mispronounced any names. Here's the abstract for this paper. Quote, "This study examines how a rural serving school district aimed to provide elementary computer science, CS, by offering instruction during students' computer lab, a class taught by paraprofessional educators with limited background in computing. As part of a research practice partnership, cross-context mathematics and CS lessons were co-designed to expansively frame and highlight connections across as opposed to integrated within the two subjects. Findings indicate that the paraprofessionals teaching the lessons generally reported positive experiences and understanding of content. However, those less comfortable with the content reported lower student interest. Further, most students who engaged with the lessons across the lab and classroom context reported finding the lessons interesting, seeing connections to their mathematics classes, and understanding the programming. In contrast, students who only learned about mathematics connections with the CS classes, thus not in a cross-context way, reported significantly lower levels of interest, connections, and understanding." End quote. If I were to summarize this paper into a single sentence, I'd say that this study compared perceptions of teaching and learning the intersections of computer science and geometry in integrated and cross-context approaches. And as always, you can find a link to this paper in the show notes at jaredoleary.com or by clicking the link in the app that you are listening to this on. Now, we've done quite a few different episodes on integrating computer science, whether it's in a specific subject area like music or just broadly speaking out about the different types of integration that you can do with computer science and other subject areas. But we haven't really had many empirical studies that actually do a comparative analysis between one approach versus another approach. I think this is extremely important for the field to explore, as it will allow us to kind of consider which approaches might work better for different contexts or different goals, visions, rationales, etc. for computer science education. So this paper begins by talking about how there are some barriers that are often reported for getting computer science into classes. That might be there's just not enough curricular time for it. It might be that the educators don't have expertise in computer science, or it might be that there's like a lack of one-to-one devices. So to address these problems, the researchers collaborated with a rural district, and they came up with a study that would kind of compare two different approaches for integrating, which would address like the curricular time issues. Should we integrate into a single class where they are learning both computer science and mathematics at the same time? Or should we do this in a way where they are learning computer science and mathematics in parallel while making connections across the different subject areas in the two different classes? And this study was guided by the research questions, quote, "What were paraprofessionals' perceptions of their implementations? What were students' perceptions of the lessons in the cross-context classroom implementation? Did students' perceptions in the cross-context group differ from their peers in the CS-only group?" End quote. It's from page 2. So in the first subsection after the introduction, it talks about the theoretical framework, which is called expansive framing. There's a quote from page 2. Quote, "Expansive framing posits that broadly framing curricula across contexts, e.g., times, places, groups of people, roles, and topics, can foster expectations that content learned in one setting will be useful in other settings. The theory advocates for the importance of interleaving contextual features to promote transfer between the context. Additionally, framing expansively promotes student creation of and authorship in their own learning. This authorship requires students to draw upon their relevant prior knowledge, holds them accountable for their own learning, and portrays learners as independent knowledge generators in response to new problems." End quote. This is from page 2 of the PDF. So this idea relates to a lot of the prior discussions on the siloing nature that tends to happen in schools. So schools tend to silo off things into, we're only going to talk about mathematics in a mathematics class, and we're only going to talk about science in a science class, but we don't talk about how the two can kind of collaborate or work together to solve different kinds of problems or explore different topics. So an expansive framing in those two particular areas might look at science from a mathematics perspective, and then look at mathematics from a science perspective. So the two going on in parallel to try and figure out how they can kind of work together. However, in this particular study, they were looking at the intersections of geometry and computer science. So how the two kind of could work together to better understand different concepts and practices from both domains. So in the next subsection, which is called Cross-Context, Expansively Framed CS Mathematics Lessons, the authors kind of talk about, well, what did this actually look like? So they had a design team that came up with the different content that was being used. So this design team consisted of a couple of classroom teachers, 3 paraprofessionals, some district administrators, 2 of them, as well as some of the researchers who were working on this project. And they all kind of came up with different ways to address some of the different needs for this specific district. which is a fantastic way for researchers and practitioners to kind of collaborate together to come up with solutions that are research-based and to kind of explore what solutions work best for different contexts. So for example, the authors mentioned that the district had a lack of curricular time to be able to devote to computer science. So they talked about how they could potentially implement and integrate computer science lessons, content, etc. into their technology classes for the computer lab time that was run by paraprofessionals, which, having worked with many districts across the country, this is something that I've seen done in multiple different places. Now, to address some of the lack of devices, they worked on some unplugged experiences or activities in addition to the computer lab time. So when they're in their geometry classes, then the students might do some unplugged lessons that would allow them to explore different concepts and practices, etc. The teachers and the paraprofessionals kind of worked together to come up with some topics and whatnot, and then the researchers created some instructional materials that were then used in the classroom. Now, because the paraprofessionals did not have a lot of CS experience and background, the researchers created some resources that were kind of similar to what they were using in the class. So the paraprofessionals used some scratch cards, which are cards that kind of like show you step by step how to create something in Scratch, like usually a very simple project or a very simple action or task or whatever. So they kind of like created their own versions of these that were related to geometry and computer science, which I think that's a great idea for the researchers to create resources that are useful and are known to the practitioners that they are working with. Now, even though they developed a couple of units, this particular study just talks about the geometry unit that was explored. So the next section is on the methods. So if you're interested in seeing like the number of teachers, paraprofessionals, etc., who responded to this, check out figure 2. But in terms of like the actual lessons that were taught, there were 2 lessons. One on quadrilaterals and the other on triangles. And students would complete a 3-question little exit ticket survey to kind of share their perceptions on the lesson that was taught. So it asks about whether or not they found the lesson interesting, whether or not they were able to connect what they learned with math class, and whether or not they understood what they worked on today. All right, so let's take a look at the findings. So research question 1 is on the paraprofessionals' perceptions. Only one of the paraprofessionals had any background with coding. The rest were pretty new to their teaching roles and to computer science. However, the majority of them reported positive experiences teaching the lessons and understanding the content. But 3 of the paraprofessionals, which is about 21%, did not think that their lessons went well. And 2 out of those 3 mentioned that they didn't really understand the mathematics concepts that were being taught. However, the majority of them said that they believe that their students had a positive experience with the lesson and that they were able to make mathematics connections. Again, this is the paraprofessionals' perceptions on this. However, 5 of the paraprofessionals, which is 35%, said that they did not think that the students actually showed interest in the lesson, which is interesting. I'm curious as to why. Was it too simple, or they just don't like math, like the subject area, that they'd rather make games or stories or whatever? Now, the authors do point out that 3 out of those 5 were the same 3 who mentioned that they were not necessarily comfortable with the mathematics content. So it may have been they didn't know how to teach it very well yet. So the findings kind of suggest that, hey, it's really important for people who are teaching content area to have some subject area expertise in that, which I totally agree with. I've talked about this with many interviews with different guests that like, yeah, it's okay to start computer science education without knowing much about computer science. However, you're going to need to learn it in the long run because you're going to need to be able to figure out how to guide students along a long path. For example, in episode 66, which is titled The Role of Deliberate Practice in the Acquisition of Expert Performance, I talk about how some K-12 educators need to think about how to develop expertise over several years. So example, like I taught high school, and in the high school, I started working with those students in middle school. So we do like free clinics and things like that. And so I was preparing them for like between 4 and maybe even 7 years to be able to improve as a drummer. When it came to the computer science content, I worked in a K-8 school, so I saw every single grade, kindergarten through 8th grade, and so I had to think about how am I going to prepare students from kindergarten all the way to 9 years later for when they graduate from that school to be able to develop their expertise over that extended period of time. If all I was doing was staying one lesson ahead, I would not necessarily be able to help those students achieve a deeper understanding of computer science at the level that I would if I had my own deep level understanding of the domain. Which is why in my free time, like air quotes there, on weeknights, weekends, etc., I was constantly learning new languages, new IDEs to work with, etc., so that way I could improve my understanding of computer science. Because again, I have no background in it. Even though I've worked with every grade, kindergarten through doctoral students, my PhD's in music education, not in computer science education. I have no degrees in it. I had to learn all of this stuff. That way I could support the students I was working with to help them when they got stuck or to know, oh, the direction you're heading, oh, that's an interesting idea. However, there is a roadblock in that platform that's going to prevent you from doing whatever it is that you want to do. I wouldn't know that if I didn't have an in-depth understanding. And it's the same thing for teachers. At least if you're doing interest-driven project-based learning, which we talk about in so many different episodes on this particular podcast. If you're doing puzzle-based where the curriculum is kind of teaching the content to the students and you're just kind of there making sure they get through the content and not necessarily guiding them yourself, then that's a completely different approach. You might not need to know much. But I would argue that kind of approach is kind of treating all students the same way, which is not going to be as beneficial or as neat of a learning experience for the students if they were to instead work on something individualized and interest-driven. But check out all the podcasts that I have linked in the show notes at jaredoleary.com to learn more about interest-driven learning and whatnot, because I rant about that and explore that in many other episodes. Now, the authors kind of unpack in this particular research question that there was some feedback that the lessons may have been too long, or not enough time to actually teach them, or that students were just kind of simply struggling with the content, or even that the paraprofessionals didn't really understand, well, why are we doing this? Like, how does this connect? What's the point of this? Now, what was interesting about this is the researchers assumed that the paraprofessionals and the teachers were going to collaborate and kind of communicate with each other, but that didn't necessarily happen. And that's something I saw time and again, whether I was teaching music classes or like computer science classes, like there was very little dialogue going on. Like sometimes I had teachers, I didn't even know what they looked like until midway through the year, because they just dumped their class off right outside my door and I never even saw them. Like they just like literally wouldn't even go up to my room. They just leave and just assume that the students were being like well behaved. Like sometimes I'd come back from a meeting with a principal that like ran late and I'd get to the class like a few minutes late and like there's nobody there supervising them. It's like, cool. Well, I'm glad nobody lit anything on fire. So I say that to just kind of vent that, yeah, there's usually not a lot of collaboration going on, especially when you don't have time and your time is like kind of planned for you. Like, oh, well, you have this like Wednesday off. Well, guess what? You're spending it in PLC's time. That's not necessarily going to allow you to collaborate or communicate with people like in other classes or outside of your PLC. All right, so research questions 2 and 3 was kind of on the students' perceptions. And this is really interesting if you take a look at figure 3 in particular. So a large number of the students said that, okay, this was interesting, they enjoyed it, they saw some connections, and they understood what was going on. But what's really interesting is the comparison between the two different groups. So this is from page 7, quote, across both the quadrilateral and triangle lessons, and compared to their peers in the CS-only implementations, more students in the cross-context implementations found the lessons interesting, saw connections to their mathematics classes, and understood the programming, end quote. A little bit further down on page 7, quote, this suggests that encountering CS and mathematics content in both the classroom and the computer lab helps students more effectively see the connections, end quote. So in other words, instead of learning it all in one space where you're learning both computer science and mathematics at the same time, instead of like combining it so that you are learning mathematics in a CS class and learning CS in a mathematics class, they're better able to see the different connections between that approach than the other approach where it is just a purely integrated class or a purely integrated lesson. This has a lot of implications for the field if we can find that this is true in other contexts. Again, this is a single district in a rural setting, so maybe this finding wouldn't translate to other classes. But one thing that I don't really understand and know based off of what I was reading, maybe I just missed it somewhere, is whether or not they're receiving twice as much instruction on the content, like when they were doing the mathematics class and the CS class, so it would kind of like twice as much the reinforcement, or were they receiving the exact same amount of instruction in the integrated class where it was not cross-context, spread between the two different classes. Like if they spent 30 minutes in math, 30 minutes in CS learning this thing, compared to the other group that spent 60 minutes in class learning mathematics and CS at the same time, maybe then that is a valid comparison. But if it's like 30, 30, 30 overall, then I don't know about that. It would make sense why the other students would be able to have a better understanding of it because they spend twice as much time in it than a purely integrated class alone instead of cross-context. Now, at the end of these Unpacking Scholarship episodes, I like to kind of share some lingering questions and thoughts. So one of them is, how would the study have compared with teachers instead of paraprofessionals? And then what about experienced CS educators versus new to CS educators? No offense to paraprofessionals, but they don't have the experience and understanding to be able to work with students at quite the same level that teachers do. There's clearly a huge continuum between like teaching ability among teachers, among paraprofessionals, etc., and there might be some overlap within that. However, in general, I would say that paraprofessionals don't have as solid of an understanding as teachers do. So how would those two kind of compare? And then what about teachers who have been teaching CS for a long time versus this is their first time doing it? It's important to kind of like explore those different avenues as well, rather than just looking at the type of integration that is being used, which again is also very important. But another question that I have is, what's your rationale for integrating or not integrating? And does the approach that you're using align with that rationale? So I've often seen districts who are integrating because teachers can't cram even more subject areas into their school day. So instead of having a standalone CS class that would take away from other time, they instead are going to integrate it into a science class or an ELA class or mathematics or whatever. But is that going to provide the best experience for students? If your reason for integrating is you think that CS is extremely important, but the way you are integrating is not placing it in that level of importance that kind of aligns with your rationale, perhaps that's something that you should explore as an administrator. Hey, we really value this thing. This is part of our mission statement or whatever, and we clearly think that CS is an important thing in the future. However, when it comes to time, we are not necessarily spending the amount of time on this that we should. This is a very important conversation to have with different administrators and to figure out where are you going to take away from in order to provide the appropriate level of time to experience and explore this new subject area? And what happens 5 years from now when you add another one? I talk about this more in many of the other integrated curricula podcasts, so make sure you check those out in the show notes at jaredoleary.com. I'm keeping this episode relatively short because I want to make sure that I don't rant about things I've already talked about in other episodes. There's well over 180 other episodes, so there's plenty more topics to explore. But if you enjoyed this episode, please consider sharing with somebody else or leaving a review on whatever app you're listening to this on. If you have questions that you'd like me to explore or kind of talk about in upcoming episodes, feel free to leave a comment on the YouTube video. But thank you so much for listening. Stay tuned next week for another episode. Until then, I hope you're all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.